asked earlier, are we going to be back in Daniel tonight? I said, yes, we are. Because the Lord's not done with what I've got to say in Daniel. And if for some reason the mission team comes back exhausted next week or delayed or whatever, I'm prepared to stay in Daniel again next Wednesday. So we'll just it'd be measuring up. Many times before you get ready to go into an undertaking, they want to test you. They want to see if you're ready. For example, I used to like to watch boxing. Sorry about that. Back in the day, I used to watch boxing. And they'd always have a weigh-in. And the two fighters would meet at a certain place before the fight to make sure that they made weight. They couldn't weigh too much, and they couldn't be too light to make sure that they were in the right weight class. So they would have the weigh-in, and they would make sure that they all were going to measure up the right way. And that's a good type of weigh-in. Then there's the thing that we all run into when we go to see our doctors. And we wonder, have we put on weight? Have we lost any weight? And we might weigh at home and we say, okay, we can't go by those scales. We've got to go by the doctor's scales. So we walk up to the doctor's scale with a sense of dread and trepidation. And you wonder, how much can I take off and it be safe? Can we take our shoes off? You do. Can you take your jacket off? Can you take your belt off or whatever? And then we stand on the scales and then we see what we measure in terms of weight. Have we gained? Have we lost? Do we regret the cheeseburgers we had the night before? Or are we thankful that the salads have done their job? But I digress. One way or another, we get measured up. And we're going to see the story of a man and even a kingdom who was measured by the Lord. They didn't measure up very well. Beginning in verse 1, it says, Belshazzar the king made a great feast to 1,000 of his lords and drank wine before the 1,000. A little bit of background. This took place about 539 BC. Nebuchadnezzar, who we discussed here last Wednesday, had passed away. After his death, his son came to power, reigned for a couple years. Then two of his sons-in-law took the throne, and they reigned for just a short amount of time. And then a man named Nabonidus came and took the throne of Babylon. Nabonidus was one of Nebuchadnezzar's sons-in-law. And when he took the throne, after a period of time, he split the duties up of being king over the empire of Babylon. Nabonidus spent a lot of his time in the other provinces of Babylon. He'd spent time in Arabia, in Egypt, and he would command the army a lot. But he had a son named Belshazzar, and he left Belshazzar there at Babylon to handle the day-to-day duties of the king for the Babylonian Empire. Now, while all this was going on during Nabonidus' reign and then later on in Belshazzar's, Babylon's hold on power in the Middle East wasn't as strong as it was under Nebuchadnezzar. Many of the people groups who lived under the reign of Babylon began to revolt. They wanted their own independence. They wanted to take over. And there were two groups called the Medes and the Persians who formed an alliance. And their goal was to take the Babylonian Empire down. Now, Babylon, if you look at a map of today's world, And if you say, okay, where was Babylon located? If you looked at today's world and you looked at the southern half of the country of Iraq, that's where Babylon per se was headquartered. The city of Babylon was between the Euphrates and the Tigris rivers. A portion of the Euphrates flowed through the city. Assyria was in northern Iraq. Babylon's in southern Iraq. And she ruled all of that area of the Middle East. The Medes and the Persians came from the land that we know today as Iran. They were Iranian-type peoples. While this is going on, the Medes and Persians are at war with the Babylonians. Matter of fact, while Belshazzar is having this feast in the city of Babylon, the city's being besieged. But the Babylonians don't worry about it. They've got food in there for about 20 years. They have the Euphrates River running through the city, so they've got food, they've got water. The outer walls of Babylon were about 30 feet thick. They were wide enough that 4 chariots could ride abreast and not touch each other. And these were solid walls. And then there was an inner wall also. By most accounts, you would say that the city of Babylon was impregnable, that there was no way that an army could get in. And they were set up for as long a siege as they thought they'd have to deal with. So Belshazzar, the king, co-king with his father, decides to hold a great feast. Said to 1,000 of his lords, and drank wine before the 1,000. They have a big banquet. They have a big party. And Belshazzar, while he tasted the wine, commanded to bring the gold and silver vessels which his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken out of the temple which was in Jerusalem, that the king and his princes and his wives and his concubines might drink therein. We see something that no heathen king had ever dared to do. If you remember, when Nebuchadnezzar, the first time that he came to Jerusalem, back in 606 BC, he took hostages. Excuse me. He took some of the treasures out of the house of the Lord. About 10 years later, when Judah rebelled again, he came back, he took more hostages, he took more treasure. Finally, in 586 BC, he comes, he destroys the city, he takes all of the treasures out of the temple, takes more of the people hostage, destroys the city. And it was still in ruins at this day. Nebuchadnezzar took all of those vessels that had been used in temple worship, and he put them in the treasury of Babylon and left them alone. Now, Nebuchadnezzar was a heathen king. He didn't come to know the Lord until much, much later in life, after the Lord humbled him, as we talked about last week. But he never bothered those vessels that had been set aside for God's worship. When they were made, the priests had hallowed them, made them holy, and say they're going to be used for the worship of the Lord and for nothing else. So Belshazzar says, while we're having this banquet, and of course he's probably drunk off his mind, he said, let's go get the vessels from the temple in Jerusalem. Let's use those, if you will, as shot glasses, as wine glasses. We're going to drink out of them. And he does so, and he defiles these vessels. So verse 3 says, they brought out the golden vessels that were taken out of the temple of the house of God, which was at Jerusalem. And the king and his princes, his wives and his concubines drank in them. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold, and of silver, of brass, of iron, of wood, and of stone. So they take these holy vessels that were consecrated for use in the temple, for use in the worship of Jehovah God, the only God, the God of the universe. They began to fill them with wine. And not only do they drink out of them, but they drink toasts to their gods, their idols that were made of, it says in verse 6, gold, silver, brass, on down to stone. You know, it amazes me that how mankind can make something, whether it's out of gold, silver, or on down to stone, that you make it yourself and then you bow down and worship it. There's something not right about that. Mentally, there's something not right about that. It's like, I'm going to build this little lectern myself, which I am not a carpenter. But say I build it. Say, okay, I'm going to bow down and I'm going to worship it. What am I worshiping? I'm worshiping a few pieces of wood and some nails that I put together. And declaring that that which I've made is greater than I am. That's what idolatry is. It's ludicrous. Not only that, but it's completely forbidden by God. And it makes no sense. It's a sin that makes no sense for you to do it. But these Babylonians, in their drunken stupor, decide that's what we're going to do. We're going to worship the gods that we've made, that we've crafted, and we're going to use the vessels that were used for the worship and for the service of the God of the universe. So they're defiled. Beginning in verse 5, we see the interruption of the feast. You can just imagine they're having a high old time. And verse 5 said, in the same hour came forth fingers of a man's hand, and wrote over against the candlestick upon the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. And the king saw the part of the hand that wrote. While this banquet was going on, in the same hour, they began to see fingers from a man's hand. And this hand begins to write on the plaster of the wall. It said over against the candlestick or the lampstand that was giving light, where everyone could see it. They could see these fingers begin to write on the plaster of this wall. And Belshazzar saw it. He saw the part of the hand that wrote. Then the king's countenance was changed, and his thoughts troubled him, so that the joints of his loins were loosed, and his knees smote one against another. You know, I can just imagine Belshazzar seeing this sight. He's no longer happy Belshazzar drinking and praising his gods. The blood leaves his face. He begins to get confused. He's worried. He does not understand this. And said the joints of his loins were loose. He can't stand up anymore, and his knees smote one against another. It scared him so bad that his knees knocked. In today's vernacular, well, duh. Of course he would. I mean, imagine us sitting here and we see a hand up here writing on the wall, just out of nowhere, and begin to write something. What would your reaction be? Similar, except I wouldn't be drunk at this time. I don't think any of us in here is drunk. But it scared him to death. The party's over. The king cried aloud to bring in the astrologers, the Chaldeans, and the soothsayers, and the king spake and said to the wise men of Babylon, whosoever shall read this writing and show me the interpretation thereof, shall be clothed with scarlet, and have a chain of gold about his neck, and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. Somebody interpret this writing for me. Tell me what it says and what it has to do with me. And said, if you can do this, you'll get a scarlet robe, you'll have a gold chain on your neck, and you'll be the third ruler of the kingdom. Well, why would they be the third ruler of the kingdom? Because Nabonidus, his father, was king, Belshazzar was kind of second in command. He was a co-regent. So third in the kingdom was as high up as he could give. And so then all the king's wise men. They probably thought, sounds pretty good to us. If we can do this, but they weren't in any better shape than the king was. They could not read the writing nor make known to the king the interpretation thereof. Then was King Belshazzar greatly troubled, and his countenance was changed in him, and his lords were astonished or perplexed. They just didn't understand it. Nobody could read the writing. Nobody knew what it meant. Everyone is dumbfounded. The party is over with. You can just imagine that every single person in that banquet hall is following the lead of King Belshazzar, because they see the writing too. They saw the hand. And nobody knows what it means. What are we going to do? And beginning in verse 10, we're going to see an indictment that's laid at King Belshazzar. Not just at Belshazzar, but the whole Babylonian Empire. It says, now the queen, by reason of the words of the king and his lords, came into the banquet house. The queen apparently was not there. Now we believe that the queen was not Belshazzar's wife, but that she was his mother. And if you remember, Nabonidus, her husband, was one of Nebuchadnezzar's sons-in-law. She was Nebuchadnezzar's daughter. She wasn't at the banquet, but she came. And the queen spake and said, O king, live forever. That's his mother. Let not thy thoughts trouble thee, nor let thy countenance be changed. You don't have to worry about this. Said, there is a man in thy kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy gods, and in the days of thy father, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods was found in him, whom the king Nebuchadnezzar, thy father, the king, I say, thy father, made master of the magicians, astrologers, Chaldeans, and soothsayers. Now, in ancient times like this, you could refer to someone as a father, even if they were a grandfather, or a great-grandfather, or a great-great-grandfather. They were still one of your forefathers. And that's why the term is used here. She's referring to Nebuchadnezzar, her father, Belshazzar's grandfather, and said, this man that I'm going to tell you of is still here. The spirit of the holy gods dwells within him. In the days of Nebuchadnezzar, he had light, he had understanding, he had wisdom. And Nebuchadnezzar made him in charge, put him in charge of all of the wise men of Babylon. Verse 12, for as much as an excellent spirit in knowledge and understanding, interpreting of dreams, and showing of hardened sentences, and dissolving of doubts, were found in the same Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. Now let Daniel be called, and he will show thee the interpretation. Daniel wasn't at this banquet either. We don't know where he was, but he was somewhere close around, but he wasn't there. Daniel at this time was getting on in years. Daniel was carried away captive in about 606 BC with the first bunch of people who were taken to Babylon. He was of the royal seed. He was probably somewhere in his mid-teens when that took place. Now it's 539 BC. He's getting around 80 or so. He's an older gentleman, but he's still around. He still has some clout in the kingdom, but not as much as he did when Nebuchadnezzar was alive. So then was Daniel brought in before the king. And the king spake and said unto Daniel, art thou that Daniel, which are of the children of the captivity of Judah, whom the king my father brought out of Jewry? I have even heard of thee, that the spirit of the gods is in thee, and that light and understanding and excellent wisdom is found in thee. Belshazzar said, "Are you Daniel?" I want to make sure it was him, which I believe he really knew that he was him. He knew that he was a Jewish captive. He said, "I've heard of you, that the spirit of the gods is in thee." Well, his mother just told him. And not only that, can you imagine that Nebuchadnezzar probably told his family and his grandchildren, those who were alive while he was alive, what had happened to him? About the dream that he had of the great image that he didn't understand, that he didn't even remember, that Daniel, through the Spirit of God, was able to interpret. Do you think he didn't tell his family about the time of when Daniel's 3 friends wouldn't worship the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar himself built? That he had them put into a burning fiery furnace, and they lived to tell about it because God delivered them from that fiery furnace? And no doubt he told them of the 7 years that he lived out in the fields like an animal, that he ate grass like an ox. He lived under the dew until God gave him his mind back. And Nebuchadnezzar realized that the God of Israel was the true God. No doubt he told his family this. But Belshazzar didn't care. All he cared about was what was going on just in his little circle, even just inside that banquet room. He didn't care about what his father, his co-king, was doing. He didn't care about the Medo-Persian army that was surrounding Babylon, that was besieging it, of what was going on, which we'll get to in just a minute. All he cared about was just having a good time. All he cared about was himself. Belshazzar said, I've heard about you, Daniel. Verse 15, "And now the wise men, the astrologers, have been brought in before me, that they should read this writing and make known unto me the interpretation thereof. But they could not show the interpretation of the thing." I brought all of my other wise men in. They didn't know what this was. They didn't know what the writing meant. Couldn't read it. "I've heard of thee that thou canst make interpretations and dissolve doubts. Now if thou canst read the writing and make known to me the interpretation thereof, thou shalt be clothed with scarlet, and have a chain of gold about thy neck, and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom." If you can do this, then the rewards are yours. You get the robe, you get the gold chain, and you're the prime minister. If you can interpret this. Then Daniel answered and said before the king, "Let thy gifts be to thyself, and give thy rewards to another." King, I don't want your stuff. I don't care anything about it. I think there were a couple of reasons why. For one, Belshazzar did not humble himself like Nebuchadnezzar did. Belshazzar did not allow God to work in his life like Nebuchadnezzar did. Even though Nebuchadnezzar was a heathen king, he did come to some sort of knowledge of the true God, and he came to trust Daniel. And apparently after his death, Daniel was just kind of pushed to the side. Daniel had gotten older. He didn't care about stuff like that. He also knew something that Belshazzar didn't. He knew how long that he had been in captivity. God had prophesied through the prophet Jeremiah that the Jews were going to be in captivity in Babylon for 70 years. Daniel knew those 70 years were just about up. He didn't need anything that Babylon had. He knew it was about time for God to visit his people and allow them to go back to Jerusalem and to the land of Judea. So he didn't care anything about what Belshazzar had to give him. He said, you just keep all that. Yet I'll read the writing unto the king and make known unto him the interpretation. I'm going to tell you what it says. O thou king, the Most High God gave Nebuchadnezzar thy father a kingdom and majesty and glory and honor. Daniel begins to recount what God had done for his grandfather. He gave him a kingdom, majesty, glory, and honor. Nebuchadnezzar probably was one of the strongest kings who's ever reigned anywhere. His word was absolute. What he said was going to happen, happened. He didn't have to talk to anybody else about it. When he made a decree, it was written in stone. It was going to happen. It said, for all the majesty that he gave him, and all people and nations and languages trembled and feared before him. Whom he would he slew, and whom he would he kept alive, and whom he would he set up, and whom he would he put down. But when his heart was lifted up, and his mind hardened in pride, he was deposed from his kingly throne, and they took his glory from him. He's recounting the humiliation that Nebuchadnezzar faced when the Lord struck him. He was driven from the sons of men, and his heart was made like the beasts, and his dwelling was with the wild asses. They fed him with grass like oxen, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, till he knew that the Most High God ruled in the kingdom of men, and that he appointeth over it whomsoever he will. In the process of time, in those 7 years, Nebuchadnezzar lost his pride. And we talked last week about he had itis. Is not this great Babylon that I have built for my majesty, for my glory? And God brought him down. And he learned from it. That thou his son, O Belshazzar, hast not humbled thine heart, though thou knewest all this. You knew what happened to your grandfather. It should be a lesson for you. But when it came time to be measured, as we'll see, you didn't measure up. But thou hast lifted up thyself against the Lord of heaven, and they have brought the vessels of his house before thee, and thou and thy lords, thy wives, and thy concubines have drunk wine in them. And thou hast praised the gods of silver, of gold, of brass, iron, wood, and stone, which see not, nor hear, nor know. And the God in whose hand thy breath is, and whose are all thy ways, hast thou not glorified. You're worshiping gods that can't see, they can't hear, they can't know. They're just dumb, inanimate objects. And you're setting them up to be your gods. Not only that, but you're taking vessels consecrated for the worship of the true and living God and defiling them. This is your indictment. Now he gets the sentence. So then was the part of the hand sent from him, this is from God, and this writing was written. And this was the writing that was written. Daniel reads it and he understands it. Many, many, tekel upharsin. These 4 words. This is the interpretation of the thing. Many. God hath numbered thy kingdom and finished it. That word many means number. Probably written here in Hebrew, which the Babylonians at this time didn't understand. And God says it twice. Belshazzar, you've been numbered. You've been numbered. Tekel, thou art weighed in the balances and art found wanting. Belshazzar, your number is up. Babylonian Empire, your number is up. God has weighed you in his balances, and you don't measure up. Your time has come. It's time for you to be judged. 28, perish. The kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. Upharsin is the plural of the word perish, which means division. Babylon's going to be divided. It's going to be given to the Medes and to the Persians. It's divvied up. No more. Because of what you've done. Then commanded Belshazzar, and they clothed Daniel with scarlet, and put a chain of gold about his neck, and made a proclamation concerning him, that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. Belshazzar did what he said he was going to do. He put the scarlet robe on him. He gave him the gold chain, made him third ruler in the kingdom, made him prime minister. Notice what Belshazzar didn't do. He didn't repent. He didn't say, what have I done? This didn't change him at all.